Family always says blood is thicker than water. But they forget that mud is thicker than water too, and it can drag you down until you suffocate in it if you do not know how to cut yourself loose. I learned that the hard way at a grand dining table, surrounded by people who shared my last name. My father, holding a crystal glass of incredibly expensive vintage wine, looked me dead in the eyes in front of 50 affluent guests and asked, "What does it feel like to be a barren spinster without a husband?" The entire room erupted into laughter. My own mother chuckled behind her hand. My younger sister smirked, swirling her drink. For 31 years, I had been the family punching bag, the invisible failure they stepped on to make themselves feel taller. But as their cruel, condescending laughter bounced off the vaulted ceilings of a mansion they did not even know I secretly owned, a terrifying, absolute coldness washed over my entire body. They thought they were humiliating a helpless, pathetic woman. They had no idea they were mocking the exact person who was about to freeze every single bank account they possessed and leave them with nothing but the expensive clothes on their backs. How did it come to this? How did a quiet, loving daughter turn into the ruthless architect of her own family's financial ruin? Let me take you back to where this living nightmare truly began, step by agonizing step. The tires of my cheap, gray rental sedan crunched loudly over the pristine, meticulously raked gravel as I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of my parents' sprawling estate. It was Thanksgiving evening, an event my mother, Cressida, had been obsessing over for months. The house was a modern architectural marvel, boasting towering brick columns, flawless landscaping that cost thousands a month to maintain, and a massive 4-car garage that was currently overflowing with luxury European sports cars. I barely had time to shift the rented car into park, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, when my father, Gideon, marched out of the massive double front doors. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy suit, every inch of his silver hair perfectly styled, projecting the flawless, intimidating aura of a proud patriarch. But his warm, inviting smile, the one he reserved for his wealthy friends and business partners, vanished the very second he recognized my dull, unwashed rental car idling in his pristine driveway. He marched straight up to my driver's side window, his face contorted in a scowl of pure, undisguised irritation, and tapped aggressively on the glass with his hard knuckles. I rolled the window down, forcing a polite, submissive smile onto my face, fully prepared to wish him a happy holiday despite the knot of anxiety sitting heavy in my stomach. He cut me off before I could even form the first syllable. "Move this piece of junk around to the back, Vesper," Gideon ordered. His voice was sharp, a venomous hiss meant to ensure the arriving guests did not hear him. He pointed a stiff, authoritative finger toward a patch of unpaved, muddy grass hidden behind the sprawling guest house. "You are taking up prime space. Declan has highly important investors arriving any minute now. Men who drive real cars. Men with actual capital. We cannot have your cheap, embarrassing rental cluttering up the view and making this family look like a charity case on a night like this." I gripped the steering wheel so tight my fingernails dug painfully into my own palms. I took a slow, measured breath, letting the icy evening air fill my lungs. I could have easily told him that I drove a rental simply because my personal, heavily armored luxury SUV was in the shop for routine maintenance. I could have told him that the passive income one generated in a single day likely dwarfed the entire net worth of every single arrogant tech investor currently sipping champagne in his lavish living room. But I kept my mouth tightly shut. In my family's eyes, I was a total lost cause. Just 3 months prior, I had called off my engagement to a man who turned out to be deeply, financially manipulative. Instead of supporting me through a difficult and heartbreaking breakup, my parents had branded me a difficult woman who could not keep a man. They assumed my quiet demeanor, my lack of a husband, and my refusal to wear flashy designer labels meant I was a tragic spinster struggling to stay afloat in the real world. I shifted the car into reverse without uttering a single word of protest. I navigated the sedan around the side of the massive property, away from the glittering lights of the grand entrance. The ground near the guest house was completely soaked from a recent, heavy autumn rainstorm, creating a literal, sprawling mud pit. I parked the car in the dark, feeling the tires sink slightly into the soft, unforgiving earth. When I stepped out into the freezing night, the thick, wet mud immediately ruined my modest beige flats and splattered the hem of my faded denim jeans. I looked down at my ruined shoes, the cold seeping through the thin material, and then looked up at the towering floor-to-ceiling windows of the mansion. I could hear the muffled, elegant sounds of live classical music and the clinking of expensive crystal glasses. Gideon and Cressida were hosting a party fit for royalty, bragging to anyone who would listen about their youngest daughter, Sutton, and her brilliant husband, Declan. I trudged heavily through the wet grass, feeling the cold dampness seep deeper into my socks with every miserable step. The bitter November wind bit through my oversized, cheap gray sweater, but the physical discomfort was absolutely nothing compared to the suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. By the time I finally reached the back patio entrance, I had to stop and spend 2 full minutes trying to scrape the worst of the thick, heavy mud off my shoes using a rough, outdoor welcome mat. I pushed the heavy glass door open, praying to slip into the kitchen unnoticed and find a quiet, hidden corner away from the judging eyes of the affluent guests. But peace was a luxury I was never, ever afforded in this house. As I stepped into the dim, transitional hallway near the walk-in pantry, I heard the sharp, nasally, unmistakable voice of my Aunt Bronwyn echoing from the other side of the thin wall. "Did you see Vesper pulling up in that tragic little car?" Bronwyn laughed, her voice dripping with absolute venom and superiority. "I swear, she looks more and more like a homeless person every time I see her. It is such a crying shame she let herself go completely. No wonder her fiancé left her. A barren spinster with absolutely no ambition, wearing cheap rags to a formal dinner. Cressida must be so profoundly embarrassed to even claim her as a daughter." I froze in the shadows, my muddy shoes rooted to the hardwood floor. The cruelty in her voice was so casual, so effortless, so practiced. They did not just pity me, they actively enjoyed my supposed misery. It made them feel superior. It validated their own shallow lives. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cool wall, letting the insult wash over me. Why was I always the designated target? Why did my pain always serve as their primary source of entertainment? Standing in that dimly lit, drafty hallway, listening to my own aunt mock my very existence to a room full of strangers, my mind involuntarily opened the heavy steel doors to a museum I kept locked deep inside my head. It was a museum of pain, a carefully curated gallery filled with decades of meticulously preserved exhibits showcasing my family's blatant favoritism, emotional neglect, and casual cruelty. Exhibit 1 was my 18th birthday. It was a day that was supposed to mark the beginning of my adult life. While my peers were celebrating with lavish parties, expensive gifts, and family dinners, I was sitting at a sticky, grease-stained table in a local 24-hour diner, wearing a cheap polyester uniform, working a grueling double shift just to afford my first semester of college textbooks. I had spent 4 entire years saving every single penny from babysitting and tutoring, putting it into a joint savings account Gideon had insisted on setting up for my education. But when the massive tuition bill finally arrived in the mail, I went to the bank only to discover the account was entirely, completely empty. I confronted my father that night, panicked, hyperventilating, and crying tears of pure desperation. He did not even have the decency to look guilty. He stood in his pristine kitchen, casually adjusting his expensive watch, and explained that my younger sister, Sutton, needed a reliable car for her senior year of high school so she wouldn't feel left out among her wealthy friends. He had drained my entire, hard-earned college fund to buy her a brand-new, custom-ordered Mercedes convertible. "You're smart, Vesper. You will figure out student loans and scholarships," he had said, dismissing my completely shattered future with a careless wave of his hand. I spent the next 4 years working 3 separate jobs, sleeping a maximum of 4 hours a night, destroying my physical and mental health to graduate, while Sutton crashed that Mercedes twice and got a newer, more expensive model each time. Exhibit 2 happened when I was 22. I had just graduated and landed a highly competitive interview for an entry-level position at a prestigious financial firm in the city. I spent 2 agonizing months skipping meals, walking miles to save bus fare, just to save up enough money for a professional, tailored black suit. It was modest, it was not a designer label, but it was mine, and I was so incredibly proud of it. It represented my ticket out of their shadow. The morning of the crucial interview, I woke up, showered, and went to the closet to find the suit completely gone. I frantically tore through the house and eventually found my mother, Cressida, in the sunlit kitchen, delicately sipping her imported espresso. When I asked her, with rising panic in my voice, where my interview clothes were, she casually mentioned she had thrown the suit into a charity donation bin the night before. It looked incredibly cheap, darling, she said, not even bothering to make eye contact with me, her focus entirely on her glossy fashion magazine. The fabric was simply dreadful. If you wore that in public, people might think our family is struggling financially. I cannot have you dragging down our pristine reputation. I went to that career-defining interview wearing a borrowed, ill-fitting, terribly wrinkled skirt from a college roommate. The interviewer noticed. I looked like a mess. I did not get the job. Exhibit 3 was still fresh, still bleeding openly in my chest. Just 3 months ago, my world had fallen completely apart. I discovered the man I was going to marry was secretly opening massive credit cards in my name, destroying my credit score, and siphoning funds into an offshore account. It was a brutal, clinical, devastating betrayal. When I called off the wedding, packed my belongings, and returned home seeking just a tiny shred of maternal comfort, I was met with a solid brick wall of judgment and disdain. Sutton rolled her eyes, sipping her mimosa, and told me I was being entirely too dramatic over a little bit of money and that I should just forgive him so she could still have a bridesmaid dress. Gideon yelled at me for a full hour, claiming I was a profound embarrassment to the family name for failing to secure a husband before turning 30. They branded me a difficult, broken, unlovable spinster. They told me I would die completely alone. But what none of them knew, what I had guarded with a level of intense paranoia bordering on absolute obsession, was the undeniable truth of who I actually was. I was not a fragile, helpless failure. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Winslow Holdings, an elite, highly secretive forensic accounting and asset recovery firm operating at the absolute highest echelons of the global financial sector. My daily reality did not involve struggling to pay rent or crying over men. It involved tracking hundreds of millions of dollars of dirty money across complex international borders, ruthlessly dismantling fraudulent shell corporations, and recovering stolen assets for high-net-worth corporate clients and federal government agencies. I commanded a vast team of brilliant, ruthless investigators. I was a phantom in the financial world, cold, precise, and incredibly, overwhelmingly wealthy. My personal net worth was a number so staggeringly large it would cause Gideon to literally choke on his vintage wine if he ever saw the balance. I maintained my modest, unassuming apartment, my cheap rental cars, and my plain, outdated wardrobe deliberately. In my dangerous line of work, invisibility was the ultimate armor. If the cartels and corrupt billionaires I hunted knew what I looked like or where I slept, my life would be in immediate, fatal danger. But beyond professional security, staying hidden was a personal test. A test my family failed every single miserable day. I wanted them to love me for me, not for a massive bank balance. Instead, they treated my perceived poverty as a permanent green light to abuse, mock, and belittle me. Have you ever had to smile through the blatant disrespect of family members who severely underestimated who you really are? Have you ever had to swallow your pride, bite your tongue, and stand in the mud just to keep the peace in a house that treats you like absolute garbage? Let me know in the comments below, and hit subscribe if you want to see exactly how I finally tore their pristine, arrogant illusion to absolute shreds. I took a deep, shuddering breath, pushing the heavy doors of the Museum of Pain back into the dark corners of my mind. I wiped a stray, humiliating smear of mud off my jeans, adjusted my oversized, faded sweater, and plastered on the meek, submissive, terrified expression they always expected from me. I stepped out of the cold shadows of the hallway and walked toward the blinding, warm light of the kitchen. I did not know it yet, but the events of the next 60 minutes would push me completely past the point of no return. I slipped silently through the heavy sliding glass doors, keeping my head down, shoulders slouched, perfectly playing the role of the defeated spinster. Inside, the massive house smelled overwhelmingly of expensive catering, rich roasted meats, garlic, and towering arrangements of fresh, imported lilies. Waitstaff in crisp, immaculate black uniforms glided past me seamlessly, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with intricately crafted, ridiculously expensive appetizers. I navigated toward the sprawling white marble kitchen island, keeping my distance from the main crowd, and poured myself a plain glass of tap water. From my shadowed vantage point in the kitchen, I could easily observe the grand, sunken living room without being directly in the line of fire. Gideon was standing near the grand, roaring stone fireplace, holding court with a group of older, incredibly wealthy men in sharp, custom-tailored suits. He was laughing, a deep, booming, arrogant sound that echoed across the entire room, demanding everyone's attention. He looked vibrant, powerful, and undeniably, robustly healthy. His face was flushed with the warmth of the expensive wine and the glow of the fire, and his posture was rigid with absolute authority. Staring at him laughing, a cold, sickening, tightly coiled knot began to form in the very pit of my stomach. My grip on the flimsy, cheap water glass tightened until my knuckles turned completely white, the blood draining from my fingers. Exactly 4 weeks ago, the man currently laughing by the fire, soaking up the admiration of his peers, had shown up at my modest, hidden apartment in the middle of a freezing night. It was pouring rain, thunder shaking the windows. When I opened the door, Gideon looked entirely, completely broken. His skin was a sickly, pale gray, his hands were trembling violently, and he appeared to have aged 10 years in a matter of days. He collapsed onto my cheap, lumpy sofa, burying his face in his hands, and began to weep. It was a terrifying, guttural, agonizing sound. I had never seen my father cry in my entire life. Not when his parents died, not ever. Between choked, hyperventilating sobs, he confessed a horrifying, devastating secret. He told me he had been diagnosed with a severe, rapidly progressing neurological disease. A condition so rare, so incredibly aggressive, that standard medical insurance utterly refused to cover the highly experimental treatments required to save his life. He claimed his nervous system was shutting down and that he only had months to live if he did not undergo an unapproved, highly specialized, totally out-of-pocket surgery at a private clinic overseas. "I have nowhere else to turn, Vesper," he had pleaded, dropping to his knees on my cheap rug, grabbing my hands with a desperate, bruising grip. "My assets are all tied up in commercial real estate. The banks will not grant me a medical loan in time. I am going to die in agony, Vesper. I am going to die." He begged me to keep it an absolute, ironclad secret. He said he could not bear to break Cressida's heart, and that Sutton was simply too emotionally fragile to handle the news of her father dying. He needed money. Specifically, he needed exactly $250,000 transferred immediately to an offshore medical escrow account to secure a spot for the life-saving surgery. I was entirely paralyzed by panic. Despite decades of emotional neglect, despite the stolen college fund, the ruined interview, and the constant, daily humiliation, he was still my father. The thought of watching him wither away, losing control of his body, and dying a slow, painful death shattered my carefully constructed emotional defenses entirely. I did not ask for medical records. I did not demand to speak to his neurologists. I did not ask for a single piece of paper. Driven by the desperate, pathetic, unconditional love of a daughter trying to save her father's life, I bypassed every single strict security protocol I had spent years perfecting for my clients. I logged into one of my highly secure, untraceable corporate holding accounts and wired exactly $250,000 of clean, untraceable cash directly into the foreign routing number he provided. I had spent the next month in absolute agony over his health. I lost sleep, staying up until 3 in the morning checking my phone constantly for updates, terrifying myself with obsessive internet research about neurological deterioration and experimental foreign surgeries. Every time he did not answer a text immediately, I assumed the worst. Now, standing in the bright kitchen, watching him heartily down his second massive glass of vintage Bordeaux and slap a local, high-profile politician on the back with enough force to stagger the man, the devastating, horrifying truth began to crystallize in my mind. A man dying of aggressive, terminal nerve damage does not host a 50-person gala. A man requiring immediate, experimental foreign surgery does not possess the physical stamina to command a room with such overwhelming physical presence and booming laughter. There was no neurological disease. There was no overseas clinic. There was no surgery. My father had looked me dead in the eye, weaponized my deepest, most primal fears, and faked a terminal illness just to extort a massive sum of money from the daughter he constantly, publicly claimed was a financial failure. The sheer, breathtaking scale of the betrayal made my vision swim. The room suddenly felt incredibly hot, the heavily perfumed air suffocating. My blood ran ice cold, freezing and shattering the very last ounce of familial affection I held for the man standing across the room. Before I could even process the magnitude of the deception, before I could take a single step forward, throw my glass at his head, and demand answers in front of his wealthy friends, the heavy silver dining room bell chimed loudly. It was time for the Thanksgiving toasts. Will Gideon get away with stealing my money? What happens when a ruthless forensic accountant realizes her own family has committed massive financial fraud against her? Keep reading, because the avalanche is just beginning. The affluent guests began migrating from the sunken living room toward the massive, custom-built mahogany dining table. I stayed hidden near the shadows of the kitchen archway, a silent ghost observing a lavish feast she was explicitly not invited to join. The hired string quartet slowly faded out, their music replaced by the clinking of silverware, and the grand dining room fell into an expectant, respectful hush. Declan stood at the very head of the long table. My brother-in-law was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a cynical laboratory specifically designed to produce arrogant, insufferable tech brothers. He wore a custom, dark velvet dinner jacket and a flashy, oversized gold watch that aggressively caught the chandelier light every time he gestured with his hands. He held a crystal flute of expensive champagne delicately in one hand, projecting the flawless, manufactured aura of a Silicon Valley prodigy about to unveil the next great invention. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, Declan began, his voice booming with a sickening, unearned confidence that made my skin crawl. Tonight is about much more than just giving thanks for our personal blessings. It is about looking at the vast digital landscape and seeing the scalable infrastructure of tomorrow. At my new startup, we are not just building software. We are completely disrupting the entire tech ecosystem. We are leveraging synergistic algorithms to create unparalleled growth paradigms that will redefine global networking. I stood in the kitchen and listened to him spew a relentless, exhausting stream of meaningless corporate buzzwords. It was an absolute masterclass in fraudulent theater. He spoke loudly of aggressive market expansion and decentralized global dominance, using terms that sounded incredibly impressive to aging real estate developers and local politicians, but were utterly, completely hollow to anyone who actually understood basic technology or finance. Sutton, draped in a stunning, form-fitting emerald green designer gown that easily cost more than my first car, stood up gracefully beside him. She placed a perfectly manicured hand over her heart, beaming with overwhelming pride, playing the role of the supportive, wealthy wife to perfection. My husband is a true visionary, Sutton announced to the captivated room, her voice dripping with absolute adoration. But even the greatest visionaries need believers. When traditional, cowardly banks lacked the courage and the foresight to see Declan's genius, one incredible man stepped up. He generously, selflessly injected his own hard-earned savings into this startup. He believed in us when no one else did. Sutton turned her glowing, dramatic gaze toward Gideon, who was seated near the center of the table. "Dad," she said, raising her crystal glass high. "Thank you for the $250,000 seed investment. Your sacrifice is the reason we are going to change the world." The 50 wealthy guests erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause, raising their glasses in a unified toast to my father. Gideon puffed out his chest, stepping forward slightly to absorb the incoming wave of praise, looking exactly like a benevolent, generous king gracing his lucky subjects with his immense wealth. I stood completely frozen in the dim kitchen, the delicate crystal of my plain water glass suddenly feeling incredibly heavy and freezing cold in my numb, trembling fingers. The elegant classical music, the cheerful clinking of glasses, the warm laughter of the affluent crowd, all of it faded away instantly, replaced by a dull, rushing, deafening roar in my ears. $250,000. The exact figure repeated in my mind like a broken, terrifying record. $250,000. The routing number he gave me while crying on my sofa. The tears streaming down his face. The fake terminal illness. Gideon had not just stolen my money. He had taken the exact cash I had desperately wired to literally save his life, and proudly handed it to Declan to fund a flashy, incomprehensible, buzzword-filled startup. He had completely exploited my terror, my empathy, and my love, converting my agony into a vanity investment just to buy the adoration of a room full of strangers and elevate his golden child's husband to the status of a genius. The sheer, unadulterated, psychopathic greed of it was staggering. The glass in my hand let out a sharp, highly audible crack. A deep spiderweb fracture ran violently down the side of the crystal. I did not feel the sharp, jagged edges pressing deep into my palm. I did not feel the small drop of blood welling up. I felt absolutely nothing but a pure, blinding Arctic rage. Before I could move, before I could scream, before I could march into that dining room and flip the entire mahogany table over, a heavy, aggressive hand clamped down brutally hard on my shoulder. I flinched, spinning around to find Gideon towering over me in the shadows of the kitchen. The benevolent, proud, loving smile he had just worn for the cheering crowd was completely gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating, furious glare. "You and I need to talk," he muttered aggressively under his breath, his grip tightening painfully on my collarbone, his nails digging through my cheap sweater. "Right now." He did not wait for my response. Using his massive physical size to intimidate and overpower me, Gideon forcefully steered me away from the lingering applause of the dining room, pushing me aggressively down a dimly lit, secluded hallway toward the back of the sprawling estate. He shoved me through a heavy, solid oak door and quickly turned the brass lock, sealing us inside his private, soundproof study. The thick walls instantly cut off the party noise, plunging the room into a heavy, oppressive, suffocating silence. Gideon marched over to his massive mahogany desk, his posture rigid with aggressive authority. He snatched up a thick, heavy manila folder and slammed it down onto the polished wood with a loud, resounding crack that made me jump. He flipped it open roughly, revealing a thick stack of dense, legally binding, terrifyingly formal documents. "Sit down and look at these," he commanded, pointing a stiff, unyielding finger at the papers. I stared at the documents, keeping my voice entirely neutral despite the absolute hurricane of rage and betrayal tearing through my chest. "What is this exactly?" "It is a petition for a permanent conservatorship," he snapped, his patience already wearing dangerously thin, his eyes wild with greed. "Your mother and I have already filed it with the county probate court. We are stepping in to take full, legal control of your life, Vesper." I leaned forward, looking at the bold, standardized legal header. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The proposed ward, the individual deemed legally unfit to manage their own life, their medical decisions, and their finances, was listed clearly as me. The primary petitioners requesting full, unilateral legal authority over my person and my entire estate were Gideon and Cressida. "You are having a severe psychological breakdown," Gideon continued, pacing back and forth behind the desk like a caged predator. "Ever since your little engagement fell apart, you have been spiraling out of control. Look at you. You show up to a highly formal event wearing dirty, muddy rags. You drive a trashy, rented piece of garbage. You live in a tiny, pathetic apartment. You are deeply, clinically depressed, Vesper, and you are no longer legally capable of making rational financial decisions." I stared at him, truly seeing him for the ruthless, soulless opportunist he was. the puzzle pieces locked together with sickening, perfect clarity. He was not just satisfied with stealing $250,000 through a fake, manipulative illness. He wanted absolutely everything. He knew I lived frugally, and he assumed I had quietly stockpiled a modest, respectable nest egg over the years. To him, my supposed life savings were just sitting there, completely wasted on a failure of a daughter. Instead of simply asking for another handout, he had decided to use the legal system to enslave me. "I am not signing away my basic human rights," I said. The words were quiet, but they carried a hard, undeniable finality. Gideon's face darkened instantly, a flush of pure, violent rage creeping up his neck. He slammed his heavy fist onto the desk, rattling the expensive pen holder. "You ungrateful, selfish, pathetic disappointment. After everything this family has done for you, you refuse to let us help you. You have nothing, Vesper. No husband, no career, no future. If you do not sign these papers agreeing to the conservatorship right this very second, I will call the authorities tomorrow morning. I will tell them you are suicidal. I will tell them you are a danger to yourself. They will drag you out of your apartment in handcuffs and lock you in a psychiatric ward. Do you understand me? I will take control of your money either way, but if you fight me, I will make sure it ruins what is left of your miserable life." He stared down at me, breathing heavily, his chest heaving, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown. He fully expected me to crumble. He expected hysterical tears, begging apologies, and the desperate, blind obedience of the weak daughter they had always painted me to be. Instead, my mind violently shifted gears. The wounded, desperate daughter inside me died completely on that spot. In her place stood the hardened, ruthless CEO, a woman who routinely dismantled international corporate fraud and destroyed billionaires for a living. My mind was already operating 10 steps ahead, analyzing the legal variables and calculating the precise, devastating angle of my counterattack. I knew if I refused, he would cause a scene. I needed to buy time. I let my hands begin to tremble. I forced my breathing to become shallow, rapid, and erratic, perfectly simulating a severe panic attack. I looked up at him with wide, terrified, tear-filled eyes. "I cannot sign this right now, Dad," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly on cue, clutching my chest. "My hands are shaking too much. Look at me. The signature will look messy and forged, and the bank will immediately reject it. They will say I was under extreme duress and trigger an investigation." Gideon paused, his eyes narrowing as he processed the cold legal logic. He was a greedy man, but he was not an idiot. He knew a contested, messy signature could trigger an automatic judicial review, delaying his access to my money by months. "I will take the packet with me," I sobbed, clutching the heavy folder to my chest like a shield. "I will take it to my bank first thing tomorrow morning. I will sit in a quiet room, calm down, and sign it perfectly in front of a licensed notary public. It will be legally ironclad. No one can question it. I will bring the fully executed documents back to you before the end of the holiday weekend. I swear. I promise." He weighed the options in his mind. The promise of a flawless, uncontested legal transfer of all my assets was simply too appealing to pass up. He smirked, adjusting his expensive cufflinks, clearly believing his intimidation tactics had worked perfectly. "Fine," he sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "You get them notarized. But do not try to run, Vesper. You bring them back to me, or I swear to God I will destroy what little life you have left." I unlocked the heavy oak door, my head bowed in fake, absolute defeat. "I will bring you exactly what you deserve," I replied softly. I walked away from the heavy oak door of the study, pushed blindly through the sliding glass doors, and stepped out into the crisp, biting night air. I navigated the dark, muddy path back to the rear of the property, where my cheap rental sedan was hidden. The exact moment I closed the heavy car door, sealing myself inside the quiet, climate-controlled cabin, the terrified, trembling, pathetic persona vanished completely. My tears dried instantly. I pulled out my highly encrypted mobile device and dialed a private, unlisted number. It rang exactly twice before Hayes answered. Hayes was my chief financial officer, a fiercely loyal, brilliant man with a mind like a steel trap, and the absolute only person on earth who knew the full, toxic extent of my family's history. Hayes, I said, my voice completely steady, cold, and stripped of any human warmth. I need you to pull up the complete, unredacted financial dossier on Winslow Holdings. Every ledger, every bank statement, every property deed. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. Pulling it up now, Hayes replied smoothly, the rapid, rhythmic clacking of a mechanical keyboard echoing clearly through the speaker. Are we finally initiating the reclamation protocols? You told me for years you would not pull the trigger on them unless they crossed the absolute line. They crossed it, burned it, and paved a parking lot over the ashes, I confirmed, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. My father faked a terminal neurological illness to extort $250,000 from me, handed it to Declan to play CEO, and is now actively attempting to force me into a fraudulent legal conservatorship to steal whatever cash I have left. It is time to tear down the illusion. The sprawling, magnificent suburban estate my parents were currently partying in was not theirs. It had not been theirs for a long time. For years ago, Gideon had gone utterly, completely bankrupt due to incredibly reckless commercial real estate ventures. To save them from a highly public foreclosure and living on the street, I had used a blind shell corporation, Winslow Holdings, to quietly purchase their massive debt and buy the deed to the house. For 4 entire years, they had been living rent-free in a mansion I legally owned, treating me like a peasant, mocking my clothes, while sleeping securely under a roof I provided. Prepare the immediate eviction notices, I instructed, starting the engine of the rental car. But first, I need to know exactly where my stolen money went. I want to tear Declan's fake tech startup apart piece by piece. I drove back to the city in absolute, heavy silence, my mind sharper and more ruthlessly focused than it had been in years. By the time I pulled into the heavily guarded, private underground garage of my downtown high-rise, the fragile daughter was dead and buried. I took the private, keycard-restricted elevator up to my sprawling, minimalist penthouse and walked straight into my home office, a terrifying nerve center of custom-built servers and ultra-high-definition monitors. I logged into my secure network, my fingers flying across the glowing keyboard, and bypassed the superficial, incredibly basic firewall protecting Declan's startup in less than 3 minutes. It was pathetic. I began silently pulling his internal financial ledgers, tax filings, and client databases. Within 10 minutes, I realized the entire operation was a completely fabricated mirage. There was no software, no clients, no developers. Just a glossy website with stock photos. Declan was running a massive, illegal Ponzi scheme, laundering money under the guise of venture capital. I tracked the routing numbers of my stolen $250,000. Declan had not invested a single cent of it. He had routed the massive sum directly to a corporate holding account of a world-famous casino resort in Vegas to settle an overdue, incredibly dangerous underground gambling debt. But it got worse. The rabbit hole went deeper. I breached his personal, unsecured banking applications and uncovered a long series of recurring, exorbitant wire transfers vaguely labeled as consulting fees. I tracked them directly to a luxury property management firm in the city. Declan was quietly paying the leases on 2 separate, sprawling penthouses downtown. I dug into the public social media profiles of the tenants. One of them was a 22-year-old girl named Tamsin. They were professional sugar babies. Declan was actively using the money he conned out of my father, my stolen money, to keep 2 young mistresses dripping in designer handbags and fine dining, all while my sister Sutton boasted to the world about her perfect, loyal husband. I downloaded every single bank statement, every casino receipt, and every explicit, damning text message, encrypting the devastating dossier on my highly secure local server. My family wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception, legal theft, and power, but they had absolutely no idea they were sitting at a table I owned, playing a game I had already won. I opened a secure communication channel with Hayes. I want them entirely dismantled, I instructed, my eyes locked on the glowing screens. I want the foreclosure notices armed and ready to file. I want ironclad legal injunctions drafted to instantly freeze every single financial asset connected to Gideon, Cressida, and Declan. And I want an automated, anonymous tip prepared with all this evidence, ready to send directly to the FBI regarding Declan's offshore wire fraud and gambling syndicates. Working relentlessly through the night, Hayes and I linked every single legal filing to a synchronized, highly encrypted digital trigger. I bound the entire arsenal of financial destruction to a single automated countdown timer. I set the execution time for exactly 7 p.m. on Thanksgiving night, the precise moment Gideon always stood up at the head of the table to deliver his arrogant, self-congratulatory holiday toast. I generated a military-grade cryptographic password for the cancellation protocol, staring at the random string of characters for 1 second. And then, with a single, decisive keystroke, I permanently deleted the password from the server cache. The system was now entirely autonomous. The digital dead man's switch was locked. The countdown timer began ticking backward on my screen in bright red numbers. The trap was inescapable, the timeline was carved in stone, and there was absolutely nothing on Earth that could stop the avalanche. The glowing interface of my primary workstation cast a pale, icy blue light across my darkened office. The automated execution protocol sat completely dormant in the center of the massive screen, a highly complex digital architecture of financial ruin, just waiting for the clock to strike. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, letting the absolute, profound silence of the penthouse wash over me. The heavy lifting in the digital realm was done. My wealth managers and corporate attorneys had locked every single legal mechanism into place. Now it was simply a matter of preparing the physical payload. A digital strike, no matter how financially devastating, was an invisible process. I needed a physical component, a tangible, heavy centerpiece to anchor the absolute destruction I was bringing to their perfect, arrogant holiday table. I opened a locked, heavily encrypted partition drive on my workstation. This was the ammunition. I needed 50 copies, enough for every single extended family member, every affluent neighbor, and every single business associate Cressida had invited to her lavish Thanksgiving showcase. I routed the massive files to my industrial laser printer, a machine capable of rendering high-definition corporate reports in seconds. I loaded the heavy trays with a thick, premium matte paper stock. The brutal truth deserved a high-quality presentation. The printer whirred to life, the rhythmic, mechanical hum filling the silent penthouse as the first pages slid smoothly into the output tray. The lead document was a staggering, undeniable revelation of my father's true financial reality. It was a comprehensive, for-year history of his concealed bankruptcy filings. The pages detailed a pathetic, chaotic labyrinth of defaulted corporate loans, completely maxed out lines of credit, and desperate secondary mortgages taken out against the suburban estate. The data proved unequivocally that the great, wealthy patriarch was a hollow fraud drowning in unmanageable debt, surviving entirely on the secret charity of the daughter he despised. Following Gideon's ruin was Declan's complete destruction. The printer spat out high-resolution spreadsheets detailing his unregulated offshore gambling accounts, showing the exact, catastrophic markers he owed to the Nevada syndicate. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. The next pages were highly explicit, itemized credit card statements and wire transfer receipts for his dual life in the city. The documents listed the exorbitant monthly leases for the 2 luxury penthouses, the routine purchases of designer jewelry, and the frequent, massive payments made directly to high-end escort services. There were even printed screenshots of encrypted text messages verifying hotel room numbers and hourly rates. It was a gross, undeniable record of absolute moral and financial bankruptcy. I carried the towering stacks of warm, freshly printed paper into the expansive dining area and created a highly efficient assembly line across my long glass table. I unpacked a box of sleek, midnight blue presentation folders, the exact kind typically used for top-tier corporate investment pitches. Moving with the calculated, rhythmic precision of a machine, I began collating the pages. I placed Gideon's pathetic bankruptcy records on the left side of the folder and Declan's grotesque financial and marital betrayals on the right. I slipped the pages firmly under the corner tabs, ensuring every single margin was perfectly aligned. With every folder I snapped shut, I pictured the faces of the people who would open them. I imagined Cressida's wealthy country club friends reading about her impending foreclosure. I pictured Sutton's smug, arrogant expression shattering into a million pieces as she saw the itemized receipts for the escorts her perfect husband was funding with stolen money. I thought of the local politicians realizing they were tied to a degenerate gambler hiding from violent creditors. It took me nearly 3 hours to assemble all 50 dossiers. When I was finished, the table was covered in neat, perfectly organized stacks of midnight blue. I carefully packed the heavy folders into 2 reinforced designer tote bags. But there was one final task. I picked up the thick manila folder containing the conservatorship petition Gideon had forced on me. The messy, trembling signatures I had promised to provide were not going to be on a legally binding document. I fed the heavy pages through my high-resolution corporate scanner. Using premium editing software, I carefully isolated the critical asset transfer clauses, the power of attorney designations, and the sweeping financial authorizations. With a single keystroke, I deleted them. I replaced those lethal paragraphs with pages of dense, legally meaningless boilerplate text concerning municipal zoning ordinances and agricultural water rights. I reformatted the document perfectly, maintaining the bank letterhead, the margin spacing, and the barcode footers. Finally, I applied my own forged, messy signatures and a surplus corporate notary seal to the final page. It looked absolutely terrifying to a layman, but to a lawyer or a bank executive, it was a worthless stack of gibberish. I slid the harmless Trojan horse back into a leather folio. Gideon would see his ultimate victory on the cover page, completely unaware that he was holding a meaningless prop. The physical props for the evening were entirely complete. The fake surrender would lower their guard, while the 50 folders would serve as the explosive payload that would level their entire social standing. The trap is fully set. My family thinks they are taming a weak, broken sheep, completely unaware they have locked themselves in a cage with a starving wolf. What would you do if you were in my position? Would you show mercy, or would you burn it all down? Hit the like button and let us walk right into the lion's den together. The sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the city skyline. I walked into my expansive master closet, bypassing the rows of razor-sharp tailored Italian suits and imported silk blouses that constituted my actual daily wardrobe. I needed to give Gideon exactly what he secretly desired. I needed to present them with a broken, submissive daughter who had entirely given up on life. I reached into the very back of a storage drawer and pulled out the costume I had worn earlier that day, the cheap, profoundly unflattering, faded gray sweater that hung loosely off my shoulders, paired with faded denim jeans and scuffed, practical flats. I scrubbed my face completely clean of any makeup, allowing the pale exhaustion of my late-night planning to show through, and tied my hair back into a messy, defeated knot. I looked perfectly pathetic. I was not about to pull up to my parents' sprawling suburban estate in my custom, heavily armored luxury SUV. Arriving in a vehicle worth more than most homes in their neighborhood would immediately shatter the illusion of my impending destitution. Instead, I contacted the private, elite security contractor I kept on a permanent corporate retainer. I bypassed standard executive protection and specifically requested a covert extraction detail. Within 30 minutes, a remarkably unremarkable mid-range gray sedan idled at the private service entrance of my high-rise. The driver was a highly trained tactical operative named Vance, dressed in a standard, unassuming windbreaker to perfectly mimic a gig economy ride-share driver. I carried the 2 incredibly heavy designer tote bags packed to the brim with the 50 explosive dossiers down to the vehicle. Vance stepped out, his eyes sweeping the perimeter with professional, silent efficiency, and loaded the immense weight of the bags into the trunk. The drive back out to the affluent, gated suburbs took just over an hour. The sky darkened into a bruised purple twilight as we navigated the winding, tree-lined roads. We pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. The driveway was now completely packed with a parade of luxury vehicles. Vance navigated the sedan through the maze of expensive metal and idled smoothly near the edge of the manicured front lawn. "I will hold position precisely 3 blocks north of the perimeter," Vance stated quietly, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "The engine will remain hot. When you signal the extraction code, I will be at the front steps in exactly 45 seconds." I nodded, confirming the protocol. I stepped out of the vehicle, hoisted the 2 incredibly heavy tote bags onto my shoulders, and gripped the leather folio in my right hand. The cold November wind bit through the thin fabric of my cheap sweater as I walked up the long, sweeping brick pathway toward the grand entrance. The house was a blazing beacon of obnoxious, performative wealth. Every window was illuminated. I pushed the heavy brass handle. The door swung open, and a wave of heated, heavily perfumed air washed over me, carrying the rich, savory sense of expensive holiday catering and the low, collective hum of dozens of overlapping conversations. The house was absolutely packed. I stepped into the sprawling, marble-floored grand foyer, instantly rounding my shoulders and shrinking my posture. I barely managed to take 3 steps past the entryway before a sharp, perfectly manicured hand clamped down on my arm with the force of a steel vise. I did not need to look up to know it was Cressida. The heavy, suffocating scent of her signature floral perfume preceded her by a mile. "What on earth are you still wearing?" Cressida hissed, her voice a venomous whisper designed to carry no further than my ears. Her grip tightened on the cheap fabric of my sweater, her perfectly lined eyes raking over my unkempt hair and scuffed flats. "Your father explicitly told you to look presentable, Vesper. You look like a vagrant. You are not going to ruin this night for Declan by parading your mental breakdown in front of his investors." I offered no verbal defense, merely letting out a shaky, pathetic exhale that perfectly mimicked the sound of a woman on the verge of tears. Cressida scoffed, a sound of absolute, unadulterated disgust. She did not release my arm. Instead, she pivoted sharply, using her body weight to physically herd me away from the sunken living room. She steered me through the crowded corridors, aggressively bypassing the magnificent formal dining room. I caught a fleeting glimpse of the massive mahogany table set with pristine white linens, gleaming silver cutlery, and towering floral centerpieces. But that table was entirely reserved for the winners of the family. Cressida shoved me into a small, drafty annex located just off the main kitchen, a transitional hallway used primarily by the catering staff. Shoved against the far wall of the annex was a wobbly, circular plastic folding table surrounded by undersized chairs. It was the kids' table, currently occupied by 5 screaming toddlers and young children belonging to our distant cousins. The plastic tablecloth was already smeared with spilled apple juice and mashed potatoes. "Sit here and stay completely out of sight," Cressida commanded, pointing a rigid finger at a tiny, unoccupied folding chair squeezed between a crying 4-year-old and a towering stack of extra dinner napkins. "Do not speak to the guests. Do not wander into the main hall. When dinner is served, you will eat quietly, and then you will hand over the papers your father prepared." It was the ultimate, breathtaking disrespect. I was a 31-year-old woman, a highly successful chief executive officer who had single-handedly built a massive corporate empire, and my own mother was forcing me to sit at a sticky plastic table with toddlers to hide my supposed failures from her country club friends. The sheer audacity of the insult would have crushed the old version of me. But as I obediently sank into the tiny, uncomfortable chair, dragging my heavy tote bags beneath the table and resting my calves against them, I felt a surge of cold, brilliant satisfaction. Cressida had inadvertently given me the greatest tactical advantage possible. By banishing me to the shadowed annex, she had placed me entirely out of the spotlight. I was completely invisible, perfectly positioned to observe the main dining hall through the open archway without drawing a single glance from the high-profile guests. I rested the leather folio on my lap, pulled my knees tightly together, and waited. The clock was ticking. 20 minutes later, the catering staff chimed a soft silver bell, signaling the transition to the formal dinner. I watched from the shadows as the sea of silk and tailored wool flooded into the main dining room, taking their assigned seats with practiced elegance. Once the initial clattering of silverware subsided, the room fell into an expectant hush. I glanced at the sleek, minimalist watch hidden beneath the frayed cuff of my sweater. It was 6:55 in the evening. Exactly 5 minutes until the digital dead man's switch engaged. Gideon rose from his chair at the head of the massive mahogany table. He picked up a heavy silver spoon and tapped it sharply against the side of his wineglass. The ringing sound cut through the remaining chatter, demanding absolute silence and subservience from everyone in the room. My father looked magnificent, the undisputed patriarch surveying his kingdom. He smoothed the lapels of his jacket and raised his glass high. Tonight, I look at this table, and I see the absolute realization of legacy. Gideon projected his deep voice, carrying effortlessly through the grand hall and into the drafty annex where I sat hiding. Vision requires a foundation. It requires a lineage of strength, resilience, and uncompromising excellence. He turned his gaze toward Sutton, who beamed under the attention. I raise this glass to my beautiful daughter, Sutton. She sets a standard of elegance that elevates this entire family. He then pivoted toward Declan. And to my son, Declan. A true pioneer. A man who understands that in this world, the weak fall behind and the strong conquer the future. Between the two of them, they represent the absolute pride of our family bloodline. They're the living proof that winners rise to the top, no matter the obstacles. My father did not cast a single glance toward the annex. He did not acknowledge the empty chair at the main table. He simply raised his glass higher, his face flushed with the intoxicating thrill of his own manufactured supremacy. To the winners, Gideon toasted, a triumphant smirk plastered across his face. To the winners, the room echoed in unison, 50 crystal glasses clinking together in a chorus of blind, foolish arrogance. I sat perfectly still amidst the chaos of crying toddlers and spilled food. I did not flinch. I simply reached down to the floor, my fingers grazing the thick, heavy canvas of the tote bags. It was 6:58. But my father, deeply intoxicated by the sound of his own voice and the captive attention of the local elite, was not quite ready to relinquish the floor. He needed a dark, pathetic contrast to make his golden children shine even brighter. His sharp gaze tracked past the towering floral centerpieces, past the sycophantic faces of Declan's supposed investors, and pierced straight through the open archway. His eyes locked onto me, sitting slumped and miserable at the sticky plastic folding table. A cruel, predatory gleam sparked in his eyes. He had a captive audience, and he was completely unable to resist the urge to elevate himself by crushing me into the dirt one last time. He raised his voice, ensuring it boomed effortlessly across the dining hall. "Tell everyone, Vesper," Gideon shouted, a vicious sneer twisting his features. "What does it feel like to be a barren spinster without a husband at your age?" For a fraction of a second, the grand dining room was entirely silent, the sheer brutality of the question hanging in the heavily perfumed air. Then, the reaction rippled through the crowd. It started with a low chuckle from one of Declan's fake tech investors, followed quickly by the polite, mocking titters of Cressida's country club friends. Within moments, the entire room erupted in cruel, condescending laughter. It was a symphony of unified disrespect. Dozens of affluent strangers openly mocking the tragic spinster in the cheap, faded sweater. I looked up through the archway. Sutton was leaning back in her chair, swirling her wine with a wicked, deeply satisfied smirk. Declan offered a pitying, arrogant shake of his head. Cressida simply took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes gleaming with vicious triumph. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not shrink back into my tiny plastic chair, and I did not let a single tear fall. Instead, I calmly shifted my gaze to my watch. 6:59 and 50 seconds. I reached across the spilled apple juice and picked up my cheap water glass. With my other hand, I gathered the heavy, reinforced straps of the 2 designer tote bags. I stood up. The transformation was absolute and instantaneous. I did not need to change out of my faded sweater to shed the pathetic victim persona. It was entirely a matter of posture and presence. My slumped shoulders snapped back. My nervous, darting gaze hardened into a cold, uncompromising, lethal stare. The terrified daughter they loved to torture simply vanished, replaced in a heartbeat by the ruthless chief executive officer who dismantled empires for breakfast. I stepped out of the shadows of the annex and walked directly into the blinding light of the main dining room. The heavy tote bags thumped rhythmically against my side with every confident, measured stride. The sharp click of my shoes on the marble floor cut through the fading laughter. I walked straight past the staring investors and marched directly to the dead center of the grand mahogany table. The cruel laughter died abruptly, replaced by a sudden, incredibly tense silence. The guests felt the atmospheric shift immediately. I radiated pure, absolute menace, commanding the space with a terrifying, icy authority that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. I stopped exactly opposite Gideon, dropping the incredibly heavy tote bags onto the pristine marble floor with a resounding, echoing thud that made several guests jump in their seats. I stood perfectly straight, staring directly into my father's eyes. His triumphant smirk had completely evaporated, replaced by sudden, uncomprehending confusion. I let the agonizing silence stretch, ensuring every single eye in the room was locked onto me. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. True power never has to shout. I spoke with a quiet, resonant, and absolutely devastating clarity. Then how does it feel knowing that this very spinster is about to stop funding your $250,000 lifestyle and evict you all? The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. Not a single guest took a breath. For a span of 10 seconds, the dining hall resembled a wax museum. Then, the blood rushed into Gideon's face. He slammed his palms flat against the mahogany table, knocking over his wine glass. The dark red liquid spilled across the pristine white linen like a fresh wound. "Shut your mouth," Gideon roared, his voice rattling the delicate stemware. "How dare you walk into my house and speak to me with such flagrant disrespect? You're having a psychological episode. You are completely insane, Vesper." He looked around the table, desperately trying to reassert control. "I apologize. My daughter is deeply unwell. She has a mental breakdown." I did not flinch. I simply looked at my watch. 7 o'clock exactly. 0 seconds. Deep within the encrypted architecture of my secure corporate server miles away, the digital dead man's switch triggered. It was a completely silent execution. There were no alarms, no flashing red lights. But in that exact millisecond, the devastating payload was deployed. The unchallengeable eviction and foreclosure notices were instantaneously filed with the county clerk. The ironclad legal injunctions slammed into the mainframe of every banking institution connected to the family, freezing their accounts into solid blocks of ice. The automated fraud alerts simultaneously pinged the federal servers of the FBI. The invisible guillotine had dropped. They were laughing at a woman they believed they had broken, entirely unaware that as of 1 second past 7 o'clock, they were completely and utterly destitute. As if summoned by the silent digital strike, the physical reality of the execution finally caught up to the room. The initial server commands had executed automatically, but the cascade of alerts took a few moments to process through the various cellular networks. It started as a low, synchronized vibration, a distinct buzzing hum that rattled against the heavy mahogany table. Then, the chimes began. First, Gideon's phone, sitting next to his spilled wine, lit up the dark wood with a sharp, frantic ping. A second later, Cressida's designer clutch resting on the floor began to vibrate violently. Almost immediately, Declan's device buzzed aggressively inside his tailored breast pocket. It was a sudden, relentless onslaught of digital panic. Ping after ping echoed through the dining hall, creating a chaotic, terrifying symphony of destruction. Gideon snatched his phone from the table, his thumbs swiping frantically across the screen. I watched the bright reflection of the display illuminate his ashen face. The crimson-red banner of his primary banking application flashed aggressively. The bold white text was unmistakable, even from a distance, declaring that his accounts were entirely frozen and instructing him to contact his branch administrator immediately. Cressida tore through her purse, pulling out her device with trembling hands. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp that bordered on a scream. "Gideon," she whimpered, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "My cards. The alerts say all our credit lines are suspended. And there is an email from the county clerk. It says a notice of foreclosure has been initiated on the estate. What is happening? Declan had yanked his phone from his pocket. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing in silent terror. The offshore accounts, the very lifeblood he relied on to keep the violent syndicates at bay and fund his double life, were completely zeroed out, locked down by the federal fraud alerts I had systematically triggered. He looked utterly destroyed. The cacophony of buzzing notifications served as the final, undeniable validation of my claims. The atmosphere in the room violently shifted from shocked observation to active, dangerous hostility. The men sitting around the table were not fools. They possessed enough ruthless business acumen to recognize a sinking ship, and I was about to hand them the manifest. I reached down to the marble floor and unzipped the two heavily reinforced designer tote bags. I pulled out the towering stacks of midnight blue presentation folders. Moving with calculated, rhythmic precision, I began sliding them across the smooth mahogany surface. I tossed them to the local politicians, to the country club elites, and to the men Declan had paraded as his brilliant investors. Open them, I commanded the room. The rustle of thick paper filled the hall as 50 confused, terrified guests simultaneously opened their dossiers. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Gasps of genuine horror echoed down the long table. A woman seated near Sutton covered her mouth with her hand, staring at the pages in absolute disgust. What you are holding is the true financial legacy of the great Gideon, I announced, projecting my voice over the rising tide of shocked murmurs. You are looking at a comprehensive history of concealed bankruptcy filings. He is a hollow fraud, drowning in unmanageable debt, surviving entirely on money he stole from my corporate accounts. Gideon lunged forward, scrambling across the table, his hands grasping desperately at the folders near him. Give those back, he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. These are forged. Do not look at them. But there were too many folders, and the damage was already done. The guests were pulling their chairs back from the table as if his financial ruin were a contagious disease. An older man in a bespoke navy suit, one of the primary targets of Declan's earlier arrogant speech, threw his midnight blue dossier down onto the table in absolute disgust. I recognized him instantly. It was Alaric, a highly respected federal judge and influential private investor. He glared at Declan with undisguised fury. You pitched us a scalable infrastructure, Alaric growled, his voice laced with venom, cutting through the sound of the buzzing phones. But this is nothing but a fraudulent Ponzi scheme. You are going to use our investment capital to pay off your markers to the Nevada syndicate. Alaric did not hesitate. He pulled his own mobile device from his jacket pocket. He dialed 3 digits and pressed the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving Declan's terrified, sweaty face. Yes, I need to report a massive, ongoing wire fraud operation. Alaric spoke clearly into the receiver, ensuring the entire room heard him. We have physical documentation of stolen funds. Send officers to this estate immediately. We have a major flight risk. The grand stage had completely collapsed. The perfect holiday dinner was now an active crime scene in waiting. I stood quietly in the center of the carnage, untouched by the panic, watching with absolute satisfaction as my family's fraudulent empire burned to the ground. Gideon, however, was not quite ready to surrender to the flames. As the men he had desperately tried to impress backed away, and the reality of an imminent police arrival settled over the room, my father played his final, pathetic card. He clutched his chest, his face contorting into a theatrical mask of sudden, agonizing pain. He knocked over his heavy velvet chair, collapsing onto the marble floor with a dramatic, breathless gasp. My heart, he wheezed, thrashing slightly against the polished stone, his hands gripping the lapels of his ruined suit. Someone call an ambulance. I am having a heart attack. It was a desperate attempt to halt the momentum of his destruction, a calculated bid to turn himself back into a victim. Cressida immediately shrieked, falling to her knees beside him, playing the role of the terrified wife to perfection. But I had anticipated every possible variable, including his lifelong penchant for cowardly theatrics. I raised my hand and signaled toward the front windows. Less than 30 seconds later, a pair of private, highly trained emergency medical technicians stepped swiftly through the grand archway. I had kept them on retainer, idling in a discreet medical transport vehicle at the edge of the driveway, precisely for this kind of hysterical escalation. They moved with absolute professional efficiency, kneeling beside my father and completely ignoring Cressida's theatrical wailing. One EMT swiftly unbuttoned Gideon's shirt and attached a portable monitor to his chest. The room held its breath. The lead medic looked at the digital readout on his monitor, then looked down at my father with an expression of profound, unfiltered boredom. "His vitals are perfectly normal," the medic announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "Blood pressure is slightly elevated due to adrenaline, but there is absolutely no indication of a cardiac event. He is completely, perfectly healthy." A collective groan of disgust rippled through the remaining guests. Alaric shook his head in absolute revulsion, turning his back entirely on the man writhing on the floor. The fake medical emergency had been exposed in under a minute, stripping Gideon of his last remaining shred of dignity. The distant, piercing wail of police sirens began to echo down the long, manicured driveway. The sound of the approaching sirens hit Declan like an electric shock. The brilliant, visionary tech entrepreneur vanished entirely, replaced in an instant by a desperate, cornered thief. Realizing his offshore accounts were frozen and the authorities were moments away, his survival instinct kicked in with pathetic results. He darted toward the ornate antique credenza against the far wall, yanking open the heavy oak drawers. He grabbed a velvet storage pouch and began frantically stuffing the family's heirloom sterling silverware into it, preparing to flee out the back service door. I turned my icy gaze away from Gideon and locked eyes with Sutton. My sister sat frozen in her emerald green gown, which suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. Her smug smirk had completely collapsed into a mask of pale, breathless confusion. "I haven't forgotten about you, Sutton," I stated, projecting my voice so the affluent crowd could hear every razor-sharp syllable. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. I ripped the seal open and pulled out a dense stack of high-gloss photographs. With a sharp flick of my wrist, I fanned them out directly across Sutton's pristine gold-rimmed dinner plate. "Look closely," I instructed, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Those are the itemized monthly payments for a pair of luxury penthouses downtown. And these are the corresponding hourly invoices for the high-end escort services your husband frequents 3 times a week." The lavish trips he claimed were corporate retreats? They were getaways for women whose names he barely bothers to remember. He funded it all with the $250,000 he stole from me. Sutton stared down at the glossy photos resting on her plate. She picked up one of the explicit receipts, her hands shaking violently. The undeniable proof of Declan's grotesque dual life lay right in front of her. She let out a choked, devastated sob, dropping the paper as if it burned her. She turned and saw Declan stuffing cutlery into his pants. Something inside her finally, violently snapped. The last remaining illusion of her wealthy lifestyle evaporated. She let out a piercing, guttural scream and lunged across the room. She tackled Declan from behind, her manicured nails transforming into claws as she tore at his expensive suit jacket. "You ruined my entire life," she shrieked, striking him repeatedly in the face and chest. "You are a disgusting fraud." Declan stumbled backward, dropping the velvet pouch. Silverware clattered loudly across the floor as the two of them crashed heavily into the buffet table, sending silver warming trays and expensive hors d'oeuvres crashing to the ground. They wrestled in the spilled gravy and broken china, a pathetic, scrambling mess of ruined silk and desperate violence fighting over spoons. Cressida realized the absolute finality of the situation. Her husband was exposed as a healthy, manipulative fraud lying on the floor. Her golden daughter was engaged in a fistfight with her scammer husband over soup ladles. The police sirens were now blaring right outside the front doors. The reality of her total destitution finally crushed her. She scrambled across the wet marble floor, her expensive gown soaking up the spilled red wine, and threw herself at my feet. She wrapped her arms around my legs, gripping my ankles with desperate, bruising force. "Vesper, please," Cressida wailed, her perfectly styled hair falling in damp, messy clumps around her face. "You cannot do this to us. I am your mother. I gave you life. I raised you. Please, I am begging you for a mother's grace. Have mercy on us. This is our house." I looked down at her weeping, pathetic form. "You love to talk about foundations, Dad. You love to talk about empires," I said, looking from Cressida to Gideon, who was still on the floor. "But you are suffering from a fatal misunderstanding of who actually owns the ground you are standing on. I am the sole proprietor and managing director of Winslow Holdings. This is not your house. Winslow Holdings purchased the primary mortgage out of foreclosure years ago. I own the landscaping company. I own the catering conglomerate that prepared this meal. I own the cars in the driveway. And you are officially trespassing." I reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out a sleek, minimalist digital audio recorder. I simply pressed play and held the small device high in the air. The crisp, clear audio cut through Cressida's sobbing. It was her own voice, recorded just a few days prior through the estate's internal security network. "As soon as the funding clears, we are throwing Vesper out," the recorded voice of Cressida sneered, dripping with disgust. "I do not care if she has to sleep on the street or in a shelter. She is a depressing drain on our resources, and I am sick of looking at her miserable face." The recording clicked off. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. Cressida froze, her hands going completely slack around my ankles. The false, desperate tears stopped instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror as she realized her ultimate hypocrisy had been broadcast to the entire room. "You do not have a mother's grace to give, Cressida," I stated, my voice echoing with icy finality. "And consequently, you have none to receive." I physically shook my legs, stepping backward and dislodging her weak grip. I turned my back on the screaming, the flashing red and blue lights now illuminating the tall dining room windows, and walked out the front door. 2 days later, the sterile, unyielding silence of my executive suite on the 40th floor provided the perfect contrast to the carnage I had left behind. I sat behind my massive desk of tempered glass and brushed steel, reviewing the final liquidation schedules of Gideon's remaining assets. The frosted glass doors of my office parted, and Sutton stumbled into the room. She must have manipulated a sympathetic junior associate in the lobby to bypass security. The woman standing before me was entirely unrecognizable. Her hair was unwashed, her designer clothes heavily wrinkled. She looked frantic and entirely desperate. "Vesper, please," Sutton gasped, her voice raw as she threw herself into one of the leather chairs opposite my desk. "You have to help me. I have absolutely nothing left. The police froze all our joint accounts. I am sleeping in my car. Please, just let me move into your penthouse for a few weeks. I just need a safe place to sleep." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, watching her performance with cold, analytical detachment. As Sutton continued to weep, her smartphone, resting face up on the glass surface of my desk, illuminated with a bright, silent notification. She was too busy performing to notice, but from my vantage point, the text message was perfectly clear. It was from a contact saved as Attorney Davis. The message read, "Just get your bags inside her penthouse. Once you establish residency for 30 days, we have a legal loophole to sue her for dependent financial support and transitional alimony. Do whatever it takes to get a key." The absolute audacity of her parasitic greed was breathtaking. She was standing in the ashes of a ruined life, actively conspiring to drain the very person she was begging for salvation. I reached forward and tapped a single manicured fingernail directly against the illuminated screen of her phone. Sutton stopped crying instantly. She looked down at the glowing text message, the color violently draining from her face. The mask of the helpless victim shattered, exposing the venomous opportunist underneath. "Your residency application is denied, Sutton," I stated, my voice devoid of any human warmth. I pressed a concealed button beneath my desk. In less than 10 seconds, Vance and 2 heavily armored corporate security officers strode into the suite. They gripped Sutton by her arms and hauled her out. "You owe me, Vesper. You owe me," Sutton screamed, her voice echoing shrilly down the glass corridor as they dragged her into the elevator, expelling her from my atmosphere permanently. The aftermath solidified with brutal, uncompromising speed. Declan did not get to enjoy a comfortable white-collar prison. The FBI had arrested him that night on multiple federal counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and running an unlicensed offshore gambling syndicate. The local news broadcast footage of him being shoved into a federal transport vehicle in handcuffs. Gideon and Cressida fared no better. Stripped of their European cars, their hidden accounts, and their towering social status, they were forcefully evicted from the estate under the supervision of county sheriffs. The final photograph I saw of my parents showed them carrying their remaining possessions in black plastic trash bags, walking through the freezing rain into a damp, flickering motel off the interstate. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, looking out over the glittering, sprawling skyline of the city. The morning sun reflected brightly off the glass towers, casting long, triumphant shadows across the streets below. I held my old smartphone in my hand. I popped the side tray open, extracted the tiny digital SIM card, and snapped it cleanly in half. I dropped the plastic fragments into the trash can, permanently severing the final, lingering thread of communication to a past that no longer mattered. I slid a fresh, encrypted SIM card into my new device, watching the secure network bars light up. I picked up my mug of freshly brewed black coffee, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip. The air in my penthouse was entirely peaceful, undisturbed by the noise of parasites or the demands of a toxic bloodline. I had burned their fraudulent kingdom to the ground, and from those ashes, I had built my own unshakable empire. I was completely, utterly in control. Many people say I was too ruthless when I refused to leave my family a single way out. But does forgiveness truly belong to those who actively scheme to destroy your life and steal your future? Was I wrong to burn it all down? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to save yourself, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of ultimate revenge.